getting ready to dye. To protect my workbench, I use these little clear, I think they're like a cutting board for cutting food, something like that. I got them at a local dollar store. Thought they'd be handy, and they have been very handy. I use them to protect everything from getting dye on it. Ooh. I guess we'll be starting on this piece. And there's a bunch of different ways you can apply dye. You could use the daubers like I do, the wool daubers, or you can get into airbrushing. That would be another good option. And the dye I'm using is just a Fibings medium brown. And I just mixed this batch up, so I'm not sure how well it's going to apply. It looks like it's going to be a little light. But when I buy a new bottle of dye, I typically dilute it with alcohol to kind of get the color I like. And also it makes the dye last a little bit longer, which is nice. I'm going to go back and hit the edges on the other one. Yeah, it's pretty light, so I'm going to go back and mix it a little heavier. But that's okay, I can just keep reapplying until I get where I want to be. These are pretty tricky to get into with the dauber. Matter of fact, I may just switch to a brush. So with the ratio of dye to alcohol I have, it looks like it's going to take a few applications to get to the darkness I like. And I've diluted my dye with denatured alcohol. You can use regular isopropyl alcohol or denatured. This time I use denatured. I typically use 91%. But it's been a while since I mixed up a fresh batch of dye, so I had a feeling the color would need some adjustment. But that's not a big deal. And with the dauber, you do get some streaking, but I find with enough applications, it's not too big of a problem. At least not for me. There may be people that think my work is a little bit more streaky than they prefer, but I like a bit of a distressed look, and it's pretty easy to get with the dauber. But 2 or 3 coats and I can't hardly tell the difference. It looks pretty even to me, especially when I go back and watch the sped up video of the dye being applied. You can see the lines just start to disappear with multiple coats. Gotta be careful with these edges because you can easily get dye on your liners, which you really don't want to do because it's not coming off. So there we go on that. I'm going to go back and hit the edges on that first one because I forgot. And like I said earlier, edge coat would probably be a really good way to go on these. I'm not going to do it this time, but I might try it on my next pair. It's just something I recently considered doing. And that's the fun thing about making stuff yourself, is you can constantly adjust your processes. So I will end up recoating these probably at least one more time to get the darkness I like, but you get the idea. And see how the brown dye on the white stitching is not ideal. It looks kind of, I don't know, it might be okay for depending on your taste, but I like the white thread to really pop and look clean, and I can't do that like this. But anyway, so I'll reapply some dye and then we will move along. Something quick I thought I'd point out is this is a scrap of leather that I dyed a little bit just to check the darkness of the dye and the alcohol mixture, which you can use denatured alcohol or 91% isopropyl alcohol to dilute your dye. Well, the dye that I use, this medium brown dye, which is my go-to for most anything brown. I'll use like just a few ounces of alcohol and then just add dye by the tablespoon until I get a mixture I like. But anyway, what I was about to say is the alcohol and the dye mixture tends to dry out the leather, and if you pay close attention, after the dye dries in your leather piece, you'll notice that it kind of curls and bows a little bit, and that's the leather getting dried out. And one thing I wanted to point out is that you need to oil your leather, especially after after you've gone through the dyeing process. I use neat's foot oil. There's probably different rules of thought on how much oil to use, but generally speaking, after a coat or two of neat's foot oil being brushed on, a real thin coat, and it soaks in and dries, the curl in the leather goes away and it feels a lot softer. And it's an important step not to miss. You don't want to just dye and then go straight wax, because the entire hide is dried out, and that's not good. So while I'm waiting for some dye to dry, I'm going to go ahead and do some cementing. I've got my very bottom layer of leather, which I've traced out my spots where I don't want to apply glue. I'm going to apply the barge cement all the way around here and all the way around this surface. Let them air dry until they lose their tackiness. They'll start to just get a gloss and they won't stick to you when you touch them. That can be, I think the directions say anywhere between 10 minutes and 4 hours or something like that. So if you're in a hurry, you can just go, for the minimum. I like to wait until all of the glue loses its wetness and shine, and then as soon as it touches together, it really adheres. And having these traced out lines on this bottom layer is going to help me line up things without too much concern about how much of the edge I'm going to have to get rid of. And the reason I leave some of this edge overhang is at this point in the way I do things is I like to take my grinder and sand down to my finished line once all the pieces are together. And the reason I leave some overhang is I don't want one edge to be in a little bit too close, and then I sand it in to the line, and then I start to cut in to the line that I want to have. So anyway, to prep for cementing, I use my sanding block and just kind of knock the shine off the top surface, knock some of the loose grain off the flesh side, and then I'll go ahead and apply my cement and stick these together. An important step, which I probably have already mentioned, is when you cement these together, you want to use a hammer. I use this little wooden mallet with a leather face to drive my pieces together, and that's an important step you shouldn't skip. And I don't think the hammer's particularly important. I probably should use something heavier. Maybe one of those dead blow hammers with a leather face would be a good option. As a matter of fact, I might try that out. But you should do this. This is what shoemakers do and cobblers. They hitting the pieces once they're cemented together is an important step. So I'm going to spare you the video on this, but I'm just going to use a sanding block to rough that up, clean that off, and I'll cement them together. So it's been about an hour since I applied the glue, and from the touch you can't tell much, it's just barely tacky. And I want to line up with my drawn lines, and there it is. No obvious issues there, so I'll go back . That's the thing about barge. It gets stronger as it's compressed and beaten and used and worn, so the bond will get stronger over time. But that's pretty much all there is. I'm going to do the other one, and then we'll keep moving along. I would quickly illustrate my point earlier that you can see the alcohol and the dye dries out the leather. It makes it curl up, which is why it's so important to oil it again later on. So I just want to show that to you real fast. Dries up, looks like a boat rocking. So since I'm prepping for sewing, I got to do some dye and different things, but some people have asked, can I look at the topic of learning how to sew? So I guess we'll kind of look at that a little bit since it's on topic. But anyway, these are the sewing needles I use from Tandy, and I don't know if there's anything special about them. I think when I've picked them up, I bought them maybe once or twice in the past 6 or 7 years, because I buy them in packs of 100. And so I don't remember even what the size this is, but it's just a standard leather sewing needle. And how do I thread my needle? Well, it's kind of a trade-off, but what I use is just the simplest thing and the fastest thing, which is to pull the thread straight through and just do a pretty basic knot. Pull that through. It's just a double loop knot. I don't know if that's what you would call it, but that's it. Just 2 knots. And it leaves a little bump, and there's some drag. But if you're very careful, you can get it right behind the eye of the needle. See if I can get that in focus. Yeah, there's just a little bit of a knot. Gives me a little bit of drag, but I can overcome that pretty easily. And the time I save knotting it like this versus threading it the traditional way is worth the trade-off to me. A few people have been asking if I could give them pointers on how to sew. I guess one extra tip I had is about the length of your thread. Typically the amount of thread you need is about, I think, 3 or 4 times the length of your workpiece. So in this case, I have a 7-inch long strip here to sew, plus this other 7 inches, that's 14 inches. Multiply that times 4, that's a lot of thread. So at that point, I just basically get the most that I can and what I feel comfortable with, and that would be a full arm span worth of thread. Just whatever's comfortable for you. Maybe you can just go ahead and use the 50 or 60 inches you need or whatever. But in my case, I just get an arm length and then I just back stitch it in. Or back stitch in my new thread to my old thread. And so we start by basically reaching center of the thread by pulling it evenly on each side. And basically I sew either to myself or away from myself the same way. It's just kind of second nature to me at this point, but the way the camera's facing would be what's typical. So you're actually looking down and working at me. You're actually looking down at me the same way you should be looking down at your workpiece, because I'm working backwards. So on this side, I'll always push the needle in through the punched side, and then I'll pull it tight and even, and then I'll take the needle from the other side and push it through that second hole. And then I'll pull it tight, and as I pull this tight, I want to get them to come through pretty evenly, because if you get them lopsided at this point, they're going to stay that way. And when you first begin a stitch, you should always back stitch. There's a few different ways to do it as far as I know, and what I'll do is I'll make 2 or 3 full stitches and then I'll go back and back stitch them all. So we'll go ahead and that left side, we'll go ahead and move that further down, and then I just pull it tight. I know you can't see the full movement that I'm making, but I'm basically just pulling my arm straight out to my sides. And then just for the sake of showing you, I'll make a quick back stitch. So we'll go back, and the reason for this is to keep the string from moving and to tighten up your stitch. If you're ever sewing along and feel like you're just not getting the right amount of tension you need, make a couple of back stitches. Even if you're in the middle of a workpiece, I think it works pretty well. I've had a few knife sheaths where I just stop in the middle of a long run and then put a few back stitches in the middle just so I can really get it tight. And then we're back at the first hole, and that's a back stitch. That's how I begin every stitch really. And then we'll go straight back. This is like we started. And the more thread you get in the way, the harder it is to get through the hole. But even with my little knotted up string that I put on the end of my needle, it's not too much of a problem. One thing you'll have to get used to is pulling the thread and how it feels in your hands. If you're not used to it, it's easy to cut yourself if you're not careful. And now we've got our back stitch completed and we can continue on. And I'm not going to show that full sequence because you could see it in a bunch of my videos, but that's basically how I started. And if I run out of thread, I go as far as I comfortably can, and I'll film this in a minute. I'll cut the thread, I'll seal it, and then when I run out of thread, I'll start recording again. You can kind of see how I deal with that, but I'm just going to continue my stitch until I run out of thread. Okay, so before I completely run out of sewing space, I wanted to show you from the side what it looks like. So I'm progressing along. This is my needle going forward. The other side comes through the same hole. Pull it tight. Needle goes forward. Pull it tight. The other side comes through. Pull it tight. So on my left side, I'm always progressing, and on my right side, I'm always going through the same spot that I just passed through. I'm only progressing through the punched side. It's tricky to do it the other way around if you have only punched in from one side anyway with your stitching holes. But since I had enough thread to terminate where it needs to be at the end of the stitching line, I figured I would just record how it ends in real time. I got lucky on the length. I hate having to join threads and back stitch in the middle of a run, but I also hate having an excessive amount of thread to deal with. And when you first get into this, a little bit of masking tape, painter's tape will help you keep from getting cut by the string if you have spots on your hands that you can feel the thread rubbing against over and over and over again, because you're pulling this stuff tight and it's easy to cut yourself with that wax thread. And we got 2 more holes, and then I'll back stitch maybe 3 places. It's easier to back stitch when you terminate versus when you begin, because when you begin you're going to end up passing through the same holes 3 times because you go forward, backward, and then forward again. But when you terminate at the end of a stitching line, you just go back once, so you've only passed over the same holes twice. Now I just went inside of a thread, which is not good. Let's see if I can correct that. It's always a risk. There we go. Try to go over the threads, or under them, rather than through them. And then we'll go like that. And actually I think I went backwards on that one because I should have came in through the stitched hole. Not a huge deal. It's mostly just to help keep you straight when you're sewing, as opposed to it actually being a necessity function. So I'm going to back stitch 4 holes. This is plenty. 2 or 3 works, but for the sake of demonstration I'll do an extra one. Now the way I end my thread run, see if we can see this. Yeah, but you've probably seen on my videos. Clip it with my scissors, then I use a lighter. I heat the threads up. I try not to burn them, but just melt the tips. Oh, try, I said. And then press them down. There are cleaner ways to do this. There are better ways to do this, likely, but that's a pretty traditional way to go about it, so hopefully you can see that. But yeah, just this is the underside of the stitching. You're not where you're going to see it. You don't want to do that on the front. I see that a lot. If you're going to do it this way, at least put your cut and burnt stitches where you're not going to look at them. And that's that. I'm going to go ahead and sew the other side, sew the other strap, and move on.